Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Readings from Gift of the Shaper. Oh my god, what's gonna happen? I'm DL Jennings. Thanks for stopping in. If you're just joining us, this is a weird spot because you're 12 chapters in already. But if you want to see them, you can go back to my playlists and start at the beginning from chapter 1 so you don't miss anything. So today we're going to be doing chapter 13, which takes place in an Athrani prison outside of Lusk, and this is told from the POV of Rimble. Lying motionless on the ground was the young blacksmith, his arms tied around him with a good length of rope. The blonde girl, not a full blood and not a half-eye, yet somehow Athrani blood flowed through her veins, was tied to his back. The two of them were planted on the ground, legs out, in front of the huge stone building. Rimble had bridled the horses nearby so they wouldn't run off, and he'd done the same with the Kinari, who was on the ground below them, bound hand and foot. Dried blood covered her face and eyes. Behind him a short distance was Bunch, who was doing his best to contain his sobs, but to no avail. "By the breaker, you're loud," Rimble growled. "He nearly took my leg off," the smaller man shouted hoarsely. "Well, you'd better hope these three don't have friends, because you just let them know where we are. Now keep it down, or I'll knock you out and tie you up myself." Turning to the small man with the wild red hair, he barked, "Twig, give him something that'll shut him up." "I'll see what I can do, Rimble, but I really think we should leave," Twig answered. Fishing around in one of his packs, he produced a strip of leather and passed it to Bunch. "Here, chew on this." Bunch took it and bit down. He sat down with his legs spread out and sobbed for a few more moments, but didn't say another word. "You think we should leave after this just falls into our laps? No, Twig, I say we stay. There's no way DeCane won't be happy to see what we bagged here," he said as he motioned to the girl. "I was afraid you were going to say that," Twig responded. "Now get that door open," Rimble said. "We need to get them inside and this one down to DeCane." Twig, who was aptly named, walked over to the huge double doors of the stone structure and pulled on the iron handle with every ounce of strength that he had. "I don't know why I'm the one pulling this door open, Rimble. You're the muscle." "You need the practice," he answered sharply. "Do you remember where the Gorai is?" With a final heave, it came open. "I think so," he replied. "Then meet me there." Twig looked petrified, but nodded and disappeared inside. As Rimble turned again to face the captives, sizing them up, and trying to figure out the logistics of moving them inside, he heard Twig's high-pitched voice coming from behind him. "On second thought, why don't I just go with you?" the small red-haired man said as he bounded back out, eager to help, and just as eager to not have to face the Gorai alone. "Fine. Then help me get them in," Rimble said. He reached down and loosened the rope that tied the two captives together. "Take the girl first," he said. "I'll get the Kinari." Twig walked over to the girl and slid his hands under her armpits, while Rimble walked over to Inara and grabbed her legs, dragging her inside like a fresh kill. The two men took them just inside the large entryway of the stone building and dropped them on the floor. Rimble walked back outside for the blacksmith, moving him inside and closing the door behind. The three captives were laid down side by side, with the girl in the center. "You keep watching here," Rimble said, "and make sure Bunch stays quiet. I'm taking this one down to DeCane." He knelt down and draped the girl over his shoulders, standing up with only the slightest effort and leaving Twig behind to watch the others while he made his way through the darkened interior. Finally reaching the hatch that led to DeCane's makeshift quarters, Rimble unshouldered his cargo and knelt to open the wooden door in the ground. He let it crash against the stone floor as he picked up the girl again and descended the staircase. When he rounded the corner into the large circular room, DeCane was standing in the middle, holding the Gorai horn that was chained to his neck. The kith seemed mesmerized by it. "I've never felt the pull more strongly," he said as Rimble entered the room. "I don't know how, but it's almost as if it hungers." Glancing at Rimble, he noticed the girl. "This one looks like she might not give you as much trouble as the last ones you brought me," he said smoothly. How was I supposed to know he could knock down walls? Rimble said defensively. Duquesne did not acknowledge the excuse. Prepare her, he said. With a nod, Rimble pulled out a knife from a sheath hanging from his waist. He knelt down and cut loose her hands, then grabbed her hair and lifted her head off the ground. 2 savage slaps wrested her from unconsciousness. She gasped and sat upright, her eyes going immediately to the knife. Where am I? What are you doing? She asked in a panicked voice. Be a good girl and keep your mouth shut, Rimble said threateningly as he pointed a finger at her face. The less you struggle, the more you might live through this. He gave a yank on her hair and began dragging her by it to the center of the room. With a sidelong glance, he added, But I wouldn't expect too much. Rimble seized her by the shoulders and slammed her down onto the altar. Grabbing her jaw with one big hand and holding her head still, he pressed his face into her hair and breathed in sharply. Moving his lips to her ear, he whispered, You'll probably be pretty weak when he's done, but don't worry. I'll take care of you. That's enough, Rimble, Duquesne said. He moved gracefully across the floor, clearly relishing the thought of taking the power of yet another Athrani. Now, he said, the Gwarai. Rimble grinned as he heard those words and lumbered off to fetch the beast. Mira could hardly contain her panic as she realized she didn't know where she was, and Thornton and the 2 Kinari were nowhere to be found. She wasn't sure when she had lost consciousness, but her head hurt nonetheless. The room she was in was large and cold, comprised mostly of gray stone, and the only light she could see was provided by rows and rows of candles that flickered in the darkness. Her face stung where she had been slapped by the big man with the scars, the same one who had grabbed her in the Talvin forest, and the same one who had attacked her and Thornton in Lusk. She could still smell his breath from when he had leaned in too closely. Be a good girl and keep your mouth shut, he had said. The words had made her skin crawl. But there was a second voice, one that had scared her even more than the ugly man with the foul breath. Now, the Gwarai, it had said. Looking around to find the source, she recoiled in horror as she met the eyes of a kith. They were swirling and wild, and sunk deeply into a face so charred that it looked as though its flesh would flake off. When the kith caught her eyes, he seemed to be noticing something for the first time. He looked down to the large white horn that hung glowing from his neck, then back to her. Ah, now I see. Only your mother was a Thrani, he observed. It let you pass as human, maybe even let you think you were one of them. Trembling, Mira asked, What do you mean? What do you want with me? Call it a test. The hair on the back of Mira's neck stood up, but not from the words. Something else was responsible. The air around her seemed to thicken as she turned to watch a great black terror being led into the room, bound by chains. Guiding it was the ugly scarred man who had dragged Mira in. Rimble, she thought she had heard him called. The thing he led had a tongue that was lashing wildly as it sniffed the air with quick, violent snorts. Mira managed to suppress her fear well enough that Rimble took notice. I don't think she's scared of him, Master Duquesne, he shouted. Can I let him go? Duquesne smiled, and the clank of chains was followed by sharp-toed reptilian feet dashing across the floor to satiate the Gwarai's taste for blood. A flash of fangs and yellow eyes streaked wildly toward their prey. Mira felt a weakness unlike any she had ever known as the creature opened wide and dug its teeth into the flesh above her chest. The pain was so sudden and so severe that it nearly blinded her. She tried to pull away in an impulse to survive, kicking her feet and pushing on the neck of the creature that towered over her, but its jaws were much too strong. Relenting, she felt herself being lifted into the air as the creature began to feed. A soft glow from the center of her chest was followed by a sudden and violent burst of light that streamed from her and into the Gwarai. The color drained from her face as she gasped desperately for air while the life was being squeezed out of her and into the creature standing over her. Duquesne held his hand just above the creature's head, hypnotized by its power as Mira's essence flowed out. She made a hoarse attempt at a scream that echoed throughout the stone structure, weakening quickly as the room was bathed in light and power. The intensity almost knocked Rimble to his knees. "I was right," the Master Kith marveled. "She has the blood." With his hand on the horns of the Gwarai, Duquesne caressed it like a child, and the creature lowered its head and put Mira back down. "After years of searching," he breathed, "we've found one." Mira was bloody and drained, but still alive, and the Kith looked at her like a tiger stalking its prey. "Kalavalur must be informed. Rimble," he said, turning to his hired muscle, "I have no further use for you. Take your men and go." "With pleasure," Rimble sneered. "I will use the Gwarai to take the girl," said Duquesne. Rimble gave a nod and a grunt as he stooped down to scoop her up. Mira felt nauseous as the big man's hands wrapped around her, and she swore she could feel him smelling her hair again. He was strong, though, and he tossed her onto the Gwarai like a sack of potatoes. "That's too bad," Rimble said, dusting his hands off. "I was hoping she could stay a little longer." Duquesne turned to the stone wall and displayed the power that made him and all Kith so feared. With a simple gesture, he threw the stones apart as simply as Rimble had thrown Mira, revealing a path to the surface that had not existed mere seconds before. Mira watched Rimble grin as she was led out on the back of the great Gwarai. She was too weak to protest, but as the walls of rock reformed behind them, she could almost feel relief as his awful face disappeared behind the stones. With a few slow blinks, Rimble coughed and looked around the room that was suddenly thick with dust. As he placed a big hand over his mouth, he scanned the room but found no sign of Duquesne or the girl. He shook his head. "Kith breaking. Sure would be nice to be able to do that," he thought. His coughing continued as he reached into his shirt pocket for the horn he'd stolen away. It was a small one, but he knew that Duquesne would be angry if he discovered him with it. He struggled to focus his eyes on it, mustering a smile. "You're gonna make me a rich man," he said out loud. So focused was he on the horn that he never even saw the dagger that had forced its way in between his ribs and into his heart. He felt the cold sting, though, and the pain that coursed through his body, while long and spindly fingers suddenly closed around his mouth. Looking up into the deep black eyes of Kinari, he could muster no more than a stifled cry as his life and breath fled quickly. He felt the knife go in again, this time to his liver, as waves of nausea washed over him like a tide. As shock started to set in, his body seized up, and the horn fell from his hands, bouncing a few times on the stone floor before lying still. Rimble's wide eyes followed it as he lurched forward in desperation, knowing it could save him, yet lacking the strength to reach it. The Kinari swiftly kicked it away and beyond Rimble's reach, standing up to strike again if needed. But the Kinari's sharp knife had done its job. Slumping forward to the ground, Rimble coughed up a bit of blood as he felt his throat close up and his life bleed away. A body with one too many scars would one day pay the price for its dance with death. Now it was simply his turn. The gurgling from his throat announced the end of a man who would rather be dead than wrong, and now he was both. So, not much to say in terms of the events of Chapter 13, except for, oh my God, what's going to happen? So, I will say that this was an interesting chapter because I'd actually gotten feedback from one of my friends who's a very big fantasy fan who also happens to be a former soldier in the U.S. Army. He was actually one of my test readers, and his name is Paul Trong. So, Paul, thanks for your contribution and all the feedback you gave me. Obviously, I couldn't have done this without you. So, Paul, interestingly enough, was able to tell me what exactly happens to a person when they're stabbed. I didn't dig too deep and ask how he knew this, but his status as a soldier at one point in the Army was good enough, and I took his credentials to heart. So I actually put in the bit about Rimble being stabbed based on his feedback for me, and pretty much rewrote it almost entirely. And interestingly enough, one of my favorite lines and a a line that a couple of my test readers said they really enjoyed, I put in because of the rewrite. And it was that last line that, he'd rather be dead than wrong, and now he was both. So that wasn't in the original draft of the book, and I have Paul to thank for that. We kind of witnessed some of the Gorai and their thirst for the blood of the Athrani, and we discovered that Mira has some sort of Athrani blood flowing through her. We're not exactly sure what just yet, but Duquesne had definitely mentioned that she's got what he referred to as the blood. So she's not an Athrani in the sense that she doesn't have, the eyes. She's not a half-eye. So what we learn is that in contrast to the half-eye like Dylas and Adrian, whose fathers were Athrani, it turns out Mira's mother was Athrani, and her father was apparently human. So when we met Dylas for the first time back in chapter 6, we learned that an Athrani father and a human mother will create a half-eye. But if, obviously you reverse that, you get the Athrani mother and a human father, and you'll still inherit the Athrani blood, but you don't inherit the Athrani eyes, which is the outwards kind of symbol, designating you as having power derived from the other world. So we'll see what happens. Stay tuned for chapter 14, and thanks for joining us.